Hey, welcome back to the Family Records. 6 days a week, we pull a random record out of my collection and explore the stories of the music and the musicians. Some of these artists you may know. Some of these records you may have never heard. Each one is a new opportunity to discover. Today's group began with a chance meeting in 1966. By 1968, the band's founders had established a romantic relationship in addition to their creative union. 1 year later, they married and officially formed today's group. Featuring a rotating roster of superstar talent, the band experienced as many soaring highs as crushing lows in the 5 years they originally created music and art. Today's album is a live recording of the band from a concert in 1969, taking place in Toronto, Canada. As the story goes, the members of the band had not played much together and spent the plane ride to Canada rehearsing. The frontman makes several references on the album to not knowing how songs will sound, as the band had never played them before. Let's drop the needle on. Plastic Ono Band. Live piece in Toronto, 1969. John Lennon was arguably the most famous member of the Beatles. Yoko Ono was a conceptual artist who met Lennon in 1966 when she was preparing an exhibit in London at the Indica Gallery. They married on March 20th, 1969, and by the end of that year, 9 months later, they had released 3 albums, the final one being Live Piece in Toronto, 1969. This also marked the first live album released by any member of the Beatles. The story of this album goes that 2 Toronto rock promoters wanted to put on a concert around the notion of a revival of rock and roll stars from the 1950s. They had a great lineup that featured Chuck Berry, Little Richard, Jerry Lee Lewis, Fats Domino, Bo Diddley, and Gene Vincent, as well as more contemporary acts like Alice Cooper, Chicago, and The Doors. The day before the festival was set to begin, one of these promoters called up John Lennon and asked if he would be interested in being master of ceremonies for the event. Instead, Lennon offered to perform at the show with a new group. The promoters quickly accepted and a deal was struck, but there was just one problem. That group didn't actually exist. It was at this point that John Lennon got on the phone and began calling everyone he knew. A roster began to fall into place. Eric Clapton would play lead guitar, Klaus Voormann would be on bass, and Alan White would play drums. After their formation on September 12th, the group was meant to fly from England to Canada that day, the day before the start of the festival. But their trip was delayed when Lennon, Ono, and Clapton didn't arrive at the airport. As it turns out, for Clapton, Lennon had spoke to his management about the concert, but he was unaware, only discovering anything when the concert organizer got in touch with him and suggested he get on the phone with John Lennon. Clapton said he got a phone call on the day we were to leave, and he said that someone had asked him to do that concert, and it was that night, so I had to make the airport in an hour. Gathering for the first time in the airport terminal, the band played their first practice together on the plane, although this was without amplifiers, and so they couldn't even hear the music they were playing. They had another plugged-in practice at the concert venue shortly before going on stage. Lennon later said that the group didn't know what to play, since they had not previously performed together. And they eventually settled on a set list consisting of older rock and roll standards, 3 Lennon-penned Beatle and solo songs, and 2 longer experimental songs featuring Ono. Though the lead up to the concert couldn't have been much more chaotic, Lennon later said that he gained the confidence to leave the Beatles during those few days. Lennon mentioned this to Clapton at the time. John Lennon actually starts the concert saying they're going to do numbers they know as they've never played together before. They played 8 songs to a crowd of 20,000 people. The last 2 songs heavily featured Ono vocalizing, and towards the end of her performance, the audience began to boo and whistle, and the band departed the stage, leaving their guitars and bass resonating until the amplifiers were turned off, and you can hear that on the album. 12 days after the performance on September 25th, Lennon went to the studio and mixed the 8-track recording. He finished the stereo master that same day, although he would return a month later to redo the Don't Worry Kyoko stereo master, removing the majority of Ono's vocals and from his songs and Clapton's backing vocals also. On December 12th, the album was released in both the UK and the US simultaneously. It was released to quash any bootleg versions that Lennon was sure would leak onto the market. Lennon recalled in an interview in December 1980 that he had to persuade Capitol to distribute the album. He says, "They said, 'This is garbage. We're not going to put it out with her screaming on one side and you doing this sort of live stuff.' And they refused to put it out. But we finally persuaded them that people might buy this." In another interview, Lennon said that Capitol were on the McCartney bandwagon, which they were on, and they thought that I was just an idiot pissing about with a Japanese broad and the music we were making. Like Toronto, they didn't want to put out because they didn't like that. The reception to the album wasn't much kinder among critics. One retrospective assessment from AllMusic said, "Side 2, alas, was devoted entirely to Ono's wailing, pitchless, brainless, banshee vocalizing on Don't Worry Kyoko and John John, Let's Hope for Peace. The former backed with plodding rock rhythms and the latter with feedback. No wonder you see so many used copies of the LP with worn A-sides and clean, unplayed B-sides. And Yoko's art is just as irritating today as it was in 1969. But in those days, if you wanted John, you had to take the whole package." However, the album seems to have inspired as many as it upset. Iggy Pop labeled the first side of the album as pedestrian, just blues. Perry Farrell of Jane's Addiction echoed similar feelings, stating that Ono's sound experimentations were a cornerstone of his musical education. Live Peace in Toronto 1969 reached number 10 on the US Billboard Top 100 and was certified gold, selling 500,000 copies. It never charted in the UK. John Lennon would pass away 11 years later, and 29 years after his death, the Plastic Ono Band came back with a new incarnation featuring Yoko Ono and her son, Sean Lennon. This iteration of the band was active from 2009 until 2015. John Lennon and Yoko Ono remain extremely influential, as well as controversial, creators. They made music to express their desire for peace and love, as many people loved them for this as hated them for their effect on the Beatles. John Lennon was fatally shot outside his home on December 8th, 1980. His message of giving peace a chance still resonates to this day. Rest in peace. The story of John Lennon and Yoko Ono is one that a lot of people know. In pop culture, it's very relevant. And Yoko Ono is still seen by many people as a villain, as much as she is a creative inspiration. For myself, personally, I can't say that I've listened to too much Beatles, not by choice anyway. Of course, when I was growing up, my parents, specifically my dad, are big fans, so I have listened to a good amount, but not by my own choice. And so I don't have the same sort of reflections on their relationship as many people, especially people my parents' age, and especially people who were fans of the Beatles, do. And I think there's a big disconnect in some ways for me, because the Beatles weren't incredibly relevant to me. And so the fact that they broke up because of this relationship, and even saying that, I think that's an oversimplification. You know, there's lots of reasons that people drift apart or change. There's a lot of reasons why creative unions that worked at one point don't as people change anymore. So I don't know if it's also fair to attribute the split up of the Beatles to specifically the relationship between John and Yoko Ono. But at the same time, as I said, I'm not as invested as many people are and were in that. So I don't know as much. So maybe I'm wrong. And if I am about that, please leave me a comment down below and just let me know why it was specifically because of John and Yoko Ono that the Beatles broke up. But personally, I never think that it's just one thing. I think that people are complex and life is complex, and there's always multiple factors that go into anything. And so it would be difficult for me to rest blame for the Beatles' separation on Yoko Ono, or even to put any kind of blame on Yoko Ono in terms of she was a creative artist trying to express ideas inside of her, and her relationship with John Lennon did further her ability to do that, truly. And I'm sure that many people can look at that and say, she's undeserving, she never would have made it without him, etc. But it doesn't matter, because the fact is that it did happen. They were in a relationship together, and that did elevate her art. And maybe that was just an express lane in what have happened with her life, that she would have achieved this type of success, perhaps not infamy, regardless, but John Lennon just sped that process up. We'll never know. But I personally find it difficult to point to one person and blame them for something that a lot of people are obviously still very upset about. And then, of course, you have the death of John Lennon, and that's a whole other thing. And what I'm finding with so many of these artists that I'm listening to is there's definitely a theme that resonates as much today as it did back then of great artists dying truly young. And, I grew up through the 90s onwards. So for me, there are just as many artists that I can name today as I'm sure my parents could from their time. So this isn't something that's changed, and the dangerous mix of fame and fortune, vice, and ultimately humanity, I think, is what causes so many of these people's downfalls, because it's a multitude of different ways over a multitude of different artists, and every one of these people has their own life and has their own experiences, and so it's difficult for me to say that just becoming famous is what makes you, because of course there's lots of famous people who don't do a bunch of drugs and die, or are not shot in front of their house, or are not shot in a car driving down the street. So it's an interesting album. It is interesting that it was the first live Beatles album and that record labels pushed back on this idea. And it's difficult to know how much of that, again, is from Lennon saying that the labels were sort of on McCartney's side versus the labels just not having the foresight to realize that live recordings of music would be popular and would sell 500,000 copies in the US. So, again, I mean, this is a fairly standard thing that I'm sure that we'll run into many times over the course of this series between artists and business people. And this is something that is as old as humanity, going back to great emperors and the artists that they would pay, all the way through to now. There's always been a conflict between creatives and business-minded people, money-minded people, because ultimately, if you're creating something, you're not doing it for money. That may be a nice outcome, but you never create something with the idea, at least I don't believe a true creation ever comes from the idea of this will make us a bunch of money. True creations are projects of passion, projects of inspiration. And so I'm not surprised that the record executives didn't think that a live album would do well, but at the same time, the ignorance of the money men never fails to astound. But ultimately, I think that this is a story, it's a funny story. It's a story about John Lennon seeing an opportunity and taking it, and then it's this crazy story about this 48-hour whirlwind of taking a band from a concept that John Lennon and Yoko Ono had to an actual band with multiple members, probably all called up within a few hours of each other, and then the trip to Canada and all of the shenanigans that must have gone on. I don't know what. Obviously, they're flying on some type of private plane. I'm assuming, since they're doing a practice session, but then they have no amplifiers, so they can't even hear what they're doing. So no one knows if the sound's any good, and they're 24 hours away from playing to tens of thousands of people. It must have been a pretty interesting time. And as John Lennon says, obviously that chaos and passing through it with, only a few boos, it sounds like, gave him the confidence to know that, he could do whatever he wanted to do, including leaving the Beatles. Because I'm sure that at that time, even if it was something that he wanted to do, it's very daunting to think about leaving something that you've been part of for so long. So anyway, with all those thoughts out of the way, I'd love to know yours. Let me know about John and Yoko down in the comments. this album or any of the other ones that you like or hate, how you feel about Yoko Ono. When am I finally going to get to a Beatles album? Because there are so many in there. And what Beatles album would you like for me to get to when I eventually do? Let me know all that down below. And just real quick on a little housekeeping note here. Didn't put up an album Monday. I took the day off with the plan of doing 6 Tuesday to Sunday. And then Tuesday, I had some new equipment come in that I was excited about. As you can tell, I'm still not mic'd up because the microphones that I got were garbage. So that totally messed up my whole day yesterday. I must have recorded the stand-up for the record that I did about 4 times. I've still got all the material ready. I've got to re-record those stand-ups. So once I do that, I can put that together. It shouldn't take me too long. I've got a bit of a busier day today, so I think we're only going to get this album on today. But sometime this week, maybe tomorrow, you're getting a twofer. So you'll get 2 albums for the price of 1. Apologies for missing a day, but we'll be back. We'll stay strong here. Keep giving you these albums 6 days a week. That's my guarantee. So you take care. You will get 6 albums a week, whether it's over 6 days or less. Have a great day. I love you all. Stay blessed. Goodbye.